tour. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining us live. It's good, good tour. Okay. Oil, go ahead, Chairman.
Just a statement for the new members of the committee. If you notice, as the length of time the committee goes on, the number of the audience gets smaller and smaller. So this is
Pete's with us.
this is normal.
We had to send some of the people from this side of the table out.
Yes, just so we'd have an audience. This is normal.
Senator Cooper left.
Fair fight.
That's right.
Very good.
It's hard.
Pete, thanks for staying with us. Very good. Well, I'll just continue where we only have one item left and we get you on the road to go home. Topic being oil refinery and fuel issues. And I looked down, I thought, yeah, we need Senator Cooper on that. I looked up and there he was. So very good. Who wants to open?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman, my name is Randall Luthi, Chief Energy Advisor for Governor Gordon. I feel like I know most of you pretty well after this morning, so I'm glad to be here for another one. What you might recall about a year ago, gas prices were very high throughout the nation and particularly the state. And Governor Gordon put together a working group to look at not just why they were high, but also to try and find if there might be short-term, long-term, and I hate to use the term solutions because that gas pricing market is so confusing and so much out of our control in many cases. So I think it's more or less options. The committee did a great job, in my opinion, and they put together a report. You have a copy of that report before you. And so it's my pleasure to introduce, of course, Director Brenda Henson, who ran the task force, and Senator Cooper, who was a key member on the task force. And so with that, as I told Director Henson, I'm now going to return to my role as eye candy, and we will let everything else go.
Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It was a real educational thing to be involved in this. And what it really showed us was just how little we can do legislatively. Our hands are really pretty well tied on it. Brenda did come up with some suggestions, but one of the things that I came away with from my involvement in this is how limited our ability is to do any of our own refining in Wyoming, and we really need to work on ways to improve that and keep our oil produced in Wyoming, refined in Wyoming, and keep those jobs here if we can. And that'll give us a better supply chain, in my opinion.
Director, introduce yourself. Thank you for coming out to camera.
You bet. Mr. Chairman, Brenda Henson, Director of the Department of Revenue, and it was my pleasure to serve as chair on this committee, orchestrated and organized by the governor. Quite frankly, I think everyone who was on the committee, I've put together, back up, a quick slide presentation that is somewhat of a summary, and you should have that before you as well. The second slide shows you the committee members, and you can see we had a vast array of backgrounds, knowledge, representation, and it really was a committee that was focused on the citizens, the companies, the business people of the state of Wyoming that were basically changing their entire budget, trying to accommodate increased fuel or diesel prices. Not just at the pump, but we also know that every single item that's sitting on a grocery shelf gets there via a truck. And they're seeing the impact of those prices. And so the cost to transport, and being in the work that I do, it cost me more to get the alcohol distributed across the state of Wyoming because of fuel prices. And so when everything that we purchase is affected by fuel and diesel prices, you can imagine when this group first got together, and that first meeting was June 17th of 2022, we spent 2 hours basically just looking at each other and saying, where do we start? What can we possibly have any visible impact on that would actually help to reduce the price at the pump for Wyomingites. And so we started with, we wanted public input. So we scheduled 2 meetings on July 15th and July 22nd. We had testimony both in person and virtually. Our audience member, Pete Overmuller, graciously provided us with an overview that was included in our considerations. And so you'll also find in the back of the report all of the folks that presented to us. And we also took just public comment, lots of things that we had not thought of within our group. This was a quick turnaround. So we came together June 17th, had public meetings in July. We met in August to discuss the report itself. And then on September 20th, we met with the governor and provided our findings. The next slide is just the executive summary, but what I'd like to highlight is we identified 3 factors, 3 major factors that were affecting fuel and diesel prices. And that was worldwide crude supply, refining capacity, and the unique regional circumstances around what it costs. I think one of the more challenging questions that we were asked is, why is unleaded fuel on this corner of this block, this price, and down the street, it's this price? What could possibly be making that much difference that you might see 10 cents a gallon difference? We found out some of those items, but quite frankly, it's just a matter of management choices for those businesses. And those certainly are not things that we have any control over in government. So going further, I'm just going to touch briefly on those 3 items. So let's talk about worldwide crude oil supply. So we think we are producing a significant amount of crude in Wyoming, and we are, absolutely. However, at the time that this study was done, we were the nation's 8th largest crude oil producer and generating about 20% of the U.S. crude production. Total U.S. crude production at that time was about 11 million barrels a day compared to global production of 100 million. So when you look at the concept of, what piece does Wyoming play in this, compared to the nation, compared to the world, there are a lot of outside factors that we really don't have any control over. So what we really found was whether we're in Wyoming producing more crude or less crude, we could not statistically find that in itself was impacting the price at the pump in the retail outlets in Wyoming. Secondly, refining capacity. That was huge. What it basically came down to is we could double our crude production in the state of Wyoming, but we don't have refining capacity, nor does the nation. The refineries in the United States are all operating at approximately 95% capacity. Not a lot of wiggle room there. And we all know after the study was done, we saw a major refinery in Colorado that had to shut down due to weather. Immediate impact on, again, supply and demand. How much fuel do we have? And so refining really became a major focus for the committee and the work group in trying to figure out what can we do with federal regulations as they are, and not a real clear picture of when that may or may not change. If I am a company and it takes a significant amount of time, to the tune of what we heard was at least 7 years from starting point to the possibility of actually building a refinery, 7 years, and the infrastructure and the permitting process, not to mention the capital for the asset itself. And with the political climate as it is today, who's going to invest that kind of money to build a new refinery? And so what we focused on and what you'll see later in some of our suggestions was how could we create this government private sector partnership to try and increase refining capacity. And Senator Cooper, would you like to add anything? I know you did a lot of research on that particular point.
Thank you, Director. I did a lot of searching and made a lot of phone calls, and one of the things that I found that I really found disturbing was the distribution system as well as the refining. Talking with a guy out of Powell, who was a bulk distributor up there, hauls his own fuel from refineries in Billings, which is a lot of that's Wyoming crude goes to Billings to be refined there, and then they turn around and haul it back. Well, the fuel was going out of Billings on pipelines, so he would drive right past the refinery to Glendive, Montana, to fill his truck, and then drive back past the refinery to get back to Powell. It's just frustrating for those people and for us too. So when I don't think there's been a new refinery built in Wyoming in 60, 70 years, who knows how long. And the 7-year thing is just too far out. So we really need, in my opinion, we need to find out how to promote rebuilding the refineries we have, defer them from converting those from petroleum refineries to biodiesel. That was a big loss when we lost the refinery at Cheyenne to biodiesel. And that same group now has bought a couple others, one other anyway. So refining is still, in my mind, the biggest hurdle we got. And what can we do legislatively to promote rebuilding our refineries and growing our refineries to keep those jobs and keep that oil in Wyoming? So.
And with that, you'll see just a brief regional refinery feedstock and capacity summary that was included in the report. I won't go over the details, but again, I do want to make sure that everybody recognizes that when we finish this report in that August, September timeframe, we have not gone back and updated anything since that time. So bear with us there. So if I may, I'd like to move on to regional considerations. Then the regional considerations, the fuel prices, as I stated, they vary significantly. So the EIA contributes the various price differences to distance from supply sources, supply chain disruptions, retail competition and operating costs, state and local taxes. So one of the things that I wanted to touch on was the retail competition and operating costs. Those varied significantly based on the testimony that we heard from the public. One of the components that I would have never thought of were credit cards. You know, everyone's buying their fuel using a credit card, and the fees that credit card companies are charging these retail outlets for the use of the credit card is significant at times. And to point of, we heard testimony that in some cases it could be 20 to 30 cents of the price of the fuel related to what credit card companies were charging. So it kind of follows along with many other things that we see in our lives where convenience has a price and people are willing to pay that price in some instances. The other piece that we heard from the marketers were that they were having trouble, particularly in August, finding fuel to even purchase to fill the tanks at the retail outlets, that they would find out when a supply was available and their truck drivers were driving all night to get in line to purchase and load that fuel. And in August, sometimes they would get to the front of the line and it'd be gone. And so that's currently. So it really was of concern to the work group of where are we going to be in 5-10 years? Because we are still going to have the diesel trucks going down the road. We are still going to have the need for fuel. Not all of our vehicles are going to be EV. And another piece of what we heard was jet fuel. We had testimony from the airports. They're having some real issues finding jet fuel for their customers that are flying in. And quite honestly, this topic, this work group, and like anything else, once you start getting into the weeds, you find out that it's pretty overwhelming, all of the pieces of that puzzle. With that, some of the policy considerations that we had, we wanted to break it down in a few different pieces. Obviously, the governor's focus for this work group was reducing the price at the pump. But what we found is that was going to be a challenge to actually reduce the price at the pump for Wyoming residents and businesses. But we did come up with a couple options. The second group are some options that would offset or compensate Wyoming residents and companies, businesses for high fuel prices. What kind of a program could we put in place? It may not be at the pump, but it would be recognizing that they're paying higher prices for everything that they purchase daily, not just the fuel for their vehicle at the pump, but everything they're buying retail wise had to get there somehow. And that cost was higher because of increased fuel prices. And then, as Mr. Luthi mentioned, those long-term actions. What could we do in the long term to ensure that vehicles 10 years from now in Wyoming had an ample supply of fuel for their vehicles? So let's go through each of those fairly quick. I think I'm doing okay.
You're fine.
Mr. Chairman, you'll shut me down if I'm taking it too long, but let's talk about the options to reduce the price at the pump. The first thing that came to mind were the apps. All of us have the opportunity. You can download gas apps. But one other possibility that we kind of brainstormed that was kind of a unique approach was a Wyoming gas app. Something that if you had a Wyoming driver's license, and we basically would have to have an agency that administered this program. But if you had a Wyoming driver's license, you went to a Wyoming retailer and purchased fuel at the pump, that you scan the receipt for that pump for what you purchased, and perhaps it was 50 cents a gallon up to a certain amount, that the state of Wyoming would basically provide a refund that would go directly into the checking account that you set up. Kind of thinking outside of the box, but the couple of things that we saw as a benefit to that is the prices at the pump for Wyomingites would be lessened, and it would encourage purchases at Wyoming retailers to purchase the fuel. It was a concept. If anybody would be interested in working on something like that, it was just one of the pieces that we put
Have you
together.
just repeat that in a quick summary for the body?
It's probably best to look at the report, and that would have been noted on page 6,
Thank you.
I heard. And again, it's at the bottom, the second bullet point, to develop a Wyoming gas app.
Okay, thank you.
The other option, of course, was to reduce the state fuel tax. As everyone knows, we charge 24 cents on both fuel and diesel. It does not increase when the price of fuel increases. It stays at that 24 cents. I will tell you, although that was a consideration, you'll find within the work group's report, we did not feel that the benefits we believe that the citizens and businesses of Wyoming benefit more from using that 24 cents to maintain our roads and to ensure that they're passable than they would by reducing the amount of money that we collect from a fuel tax and sending it back to the purchaser. So while it's in the report, it was considered, it was not something that we were advocating for. Eliminate the statutory prohibition on charging less than the cost of the product. That's also covered, I believe, on page 7. That was a unique law that the work group was not really familiar with. And we basically found out more information about a law that was passed, not specific to fuel, but specific to any product, that there is a restriction that says a retailer cannot sell that product for less than the cost of the product. And there are a lot of reasons for that. I won't go into them now, but it is covered in the report somewhat. And the other, the testimony that we received is that that would not be, in the long run, that would not be from the retailers or the marketers' perspective, that would not be a good approach to solving the price at the pump. Continue efforts to substantially increase the leasing of federal oil and gas reserves. I don't have to tell this group what that involves and the challenges that are there. But although there are challenges present, the work group felt we would be remiss if we didn't at least include it in the findings of the report. The second piece was, how do we offset or compensate Wyoming residents for high fuel prices? So we've got a program that's in place called the tax refund for the elderly and disabled. It's a statute that's on the books, has been for years. It's administered by the Department of Health, used to be administered by the county assessors. You used to get your application at the assessor's office in the 80s. Basically, it's you're elderly or you're 100% disabled and receiving Social Security benefits, and you can apply for this benefit. It has not been funded in several years, but the original intent of this tax refund for the elderly and disabled was to provide a refund of fuel tax, sales tax, property tax. It was intended to help these individuals, low income, elderly, with those taxes. So that was another option. Our only concern was, our charge was to reduce the price at the pump. And quite honestly, the folks that would be eligible for this program, even if it were funded, are typically not driving a lot. They're not the ones paying the price at the pump. Are they paying the price in the items on the grocery shelf and those items that they purchase on a regular basis? Absolutely, but it's not the price at the pump. So we didn't feel it was a great solution. The other was a dynamic sales tax, and this is a concept that was brought to the work group that just basically said that we should somehow tie the rate of our state sales tax, that 4%, that we should somehow tie that to major commodity prices. And with the thought process being, if we are collecting more in sales tax revenue based on those large commodity prices, that we could have a fluctuating sales tax rate, and that if collections are up, we could perhaps quarterly, drop the sales tax rate. So just another concept that was presented. The third that really probably we spent the majority of our time on was this long-term actions. What can we do in the future? We may not be able to do anything immediately, but what can we do for the long term? The suggestion was made that we bring more product in on rail cars, additional pipelines, to transport the product, and also along with that, storage. We heard quite a bit of testimony that if we had storage facilities in Wyoming where we could bring inventory and have supplies at the ready, for perhaps those times in those July, August, September timeframes when supplies are really going down for those retailers to purchase, maybe we need to have storage facilities expanded. We heard testimony from a company in Cheyenne that had the beginnings, but quite honestly felt that it just was too big of a risk for them to invest the capital that was needed. A very similar discussion like we had with refineries themselves. But it really made us think that we need some sort of partnership, again, government, private sector partnership that would assist these companies with that initial capital outlay for these projects, both for pipelines and for storage locally. Streamline the permitting process for increased refining capacity. Going back to that slide where we kind of gave you a synopsis of what the refinery status is. Is it easier to expand an existing refinery? The consensus in the work group was yes, that the permitting would be shortened. But our thought process was if this is a direction that we as a state wanted to go, that we could get the people in the room to get this, to get all the processes, get the Wyoming Energy Authority in the room to talk about what money is available for some of these types of projects, try and figure out all of the permitting process and make sure, what do we have control over, what's not in our control, but work with what we do have control over. So that was something that we had suggested. Develop incentives for keeping existing refining capacity. What we're dealing with and what we saw come to fruition is federal policy, federal tax policy is the reason that we've lost refining capacity in the state of Wyoming for our own fuel needs. And so we don't have any control over that, but we do have control over providing incentives that perhaps would counter some of those federal policies, but that's going to take a lot more research. I don't know. I'm not as versed in
Just a moment,
those.
please. Go ahead, Representative.
Ma'am, can you expand on that a little bit? What type of federal regulations are you speaking of that are hindering our refineries? Just curious.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Randall.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Tarver, most of that would be and actually would come indirectly through EPA. If it happens to be a water permit, if they're into a watershed or that, then we have to deal directly with EPA. Otherwise, they would be state through DEQ because they have primacy. What have we found particularly if there's any federal funds involved, or major federal action, which you may require if there's certain permitting of a refinery, then you're full blown into NEPA process rather than that be an environmental analysis or an EIS. So what the task force talked about is looking at how do we avoid that, and it seemed that it would be easier to do it for an existing refinery if they wanted to expand, that there would be less permitting required. And most of the work had been done on the original refinery where you might be able to just tear off on that. And while I've got the mic, if you don't mind, Mr. Chairman, I think if you want to just put one in one bucket that I think you really want to look at is one major issue is you don't have enough product in the state of Wyoming when there are shortages. Now, we may not have shortages today. This report is dated last year, but I can promise you that most of these conditions still exist. So you look at how do we actually get more product into Wyoming, either for storage or for use? Because first of all, if you've got more, you're also going to be able to help avoid some of the highs and lows as the market changes. And you're just going to have more product that's available, which of course in the law of supply and demand should make a difference. I would point out that those of you, I think, that watch Shark Tank, I don't, but I guess Kevin O'Leary announced that he wants to build an oil refinery. To me, that's what I heard. He wants to build an oil refinery. What did I hear? In Wyoming. So I think that as we look forward for options, I think that's one you look at. The legislature just this year added refineries as a specific purpose for WEA. There's bonding authority. There's a governor's energy matching fund. I think those are some of the long-term solutions. I think those are some of the most viable ones that we look at for a solution to, again, the overall, how do you increase that bucket of product?
Just follow up, Mr. Luthi, are you saying that's our ultimate problem here? Is just having that situation solved?
According to Randall Luthi, that is the big bucket I think we should be looking at, is how do you get more product consistently in the state?
Would you reach out to the existing people that are in this industry, or are we going to court someone new? Sir,
I'm sorry, I just didn't quite under.
would we reach out to the existing industry or court someone new to help us with this?
Mr. Chairman, I always want to start with those who brought us so far. And so I think we start with the existing.
Okay.
And you see in the report, we've got a list of the existing refineries, what they're doing. And I think that's where we start. But if Kevin O'Leary wants to bring $1 billion in, let him come.
I don't know Kevin O'Leary, but sure,
Yeah, why
we'll
not?
work with him.
So, yeah.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman.
Okay, go ahead.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. What is the comparison between our consumption rate of gasoline versus our refined production capacity on a daily basis? So I see the refined production capacity through the refinery chart that's provided. And I see that a lot of that's effectively exported to other locations. But what I don't know is how much do we actually consume relative to that refined capacity?
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Thank you, Senator Rothfuss, for asking a question that I do not know the answer to. But I do believe I can find it relatively, I'd get back to you on that. And either percentage or in barrels, I assume you don't care which.
No,
Yeah.
either way.
Certainly, we refine more than we use.
Right.
Yeah. So your question, I think then is, well, if we already refine more than we use, what good would it be to have more, product sitting in? Well, because if we're able to, in my mind, again, if you're able to have more in the state of Wyoming, you're going to help meet those regional needs as well. And therefore, we're not losing so much to that Denver market, to the Billings market, just because of large population. When it gets down to it, we'll still have more product in the state.
Mr. Chairman, and I think that's certainly the case, that the more that's available, the easier that will be. But I do think that if we're producing more in-state than we're consuming in-state, that does point to a problem in addition to just supply demand, because our supply is higher than our demand domestically, which means distribution then becomes a key provision of it, not just supply. I mean, you look at the supply demand chain on the supply side of oil, there's a little bit of mention of more drilling. Well, at the end of the day, we're not even close to consumption of the amount of oil we produce, right? And never will be probably. Then refined capacity, it looks like we exceed, but I don't know by how much. I mean, if it's close, then I can see that there's some friction that's going to be there. And at that point, we would like a surplus, and that should bring the price down. But if we're still providing a refined production capacity, which is twice what we consume, then I don't think that's the problem any longer. I think it's a distribution problem. And I'm just curious about that analysis. So yeah, it sounds like we don't have the answer today on that.
Economics question. You want to hold that one off? Want to answer? Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, Senator, I do believe that the Department of Transportation, they had provided us some numbers related to the fuel tax, which gives us a pretty good indication. So I can get back with you on that. I think that there's a link to their presentation included in the work group's report. I think you have brought up, it's one of those things where basically, okay, we produce the crude. Where is it refined? If we could follow that barrel of crude through that process to the final retail spot, and then also finding out, so how much are we importing into the state of Wyoming versus how much crude is leaving? That in itself, just to map that flow, while challenging, it would certainly be informative. So I appreciate the question.
And Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead.
and I recall the last time we raised the gasoline tax, I'm sure others recall this as well. There was a lot of discussion about this rack price, which is then based on regional distribution, and the fact that my understanding is that we don't have a strong regional distribution presence in Wyoming. And that then when they distribute on a regional market price as opposed to a local community price, which was a big discussion when we were looking at the economics of changing our gas tax, where the prediction, which turned out to be true, was that a 10% increase in the gas tax would actually have no effect on the pump price relative to regional prices. That turned out to be accurate. And that kind of gets back at the fact that perhaps that distribution level and the fact that the state of Wyoming does not seem to be involved with regional distribution of the asset, even if we have the production here of that asset, would contribute. And I don't know what we can do about that. I don't know how we get in that game, but it seems like that's an additional component that might be considered.
Response, and then we'll go to the co-chair. Go ahead, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Over the last 6 months since we finalized this report, I've still made a lot of calls and done a lot of research on this. And that regional distribution system you're talking about, Senator Rothfuss, is a big piece of what's wrong. I only know of one truck terminal in the state, and that's the one up there out of Sheridan. That fuel is railed in, I believe, I think there's one south of Gillette, but I believe that's primarily used for the mines down there. But that fuel is railed in and then pipelined over to the terminal. So we end up with a huge amount of freight, and most all of the fuel in northern Wyoming is coming out of Montana. And look where the refineries are. We have a refinery in Cheyenne. We have the Parco refinery on I-80. We have a small refinery left in Casper and a small one in Newcastle. So it isn't as much capacity as where it is. And that's what we're starting to see more of now is how do we put a regional distribution system in across the state where we have some major tanks that we can rail into and a company can store fuel relatively close to their market. On a seasonal basis, even, in the Bighorn Basin, we were in trouble last fall trying to get fuel there for the farmers so we get the beets out of the ground. So, I think a regional system of some sort is something we really need to be looking at. And
Before we go to the co-chair, any of you, Randall, do we have to statutorily open the door for that? To create a regional storage system?
I didn't understand what you said, sir.
Yeah, either one of you. Do we need any statute that opens up the door for regional storage?
I hate to give you I don't know, but I think if we can tie it back in, can we form some kind of a partnership again to create the ability to have that? And again, that I'm not going to give up on my bucket entirely, Senator Rothfuss, because maybe the bucket, part of the bucket's full on one half and not on the other. But again, if you're able to store more product in Wyoming, that's where I think you can then start to build a distribution center out of.
We got to have it here, Mr. Co-Chair.
Yep. So.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Henson. So fuel in a tank, gasoline in a storage tank, there's no tax paid on that, is there? It's because it's considered a commodity and we don't have inventory. We don't have an inventory tax. Am I right or wrong?
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, Co-Chairman Burkhart, as far as sales tax, you're right. There's no tax on that at the pump. When you buy a gallon of gas at the pump, you are not paying any sales tax.
Follow up, Mr. Chairman. Director Henson, I wasn't real clear.
Okay.
So just stored in a tank at the refinery.
Director?
Is there any tax on that fuel stored in that tank?
Mr. Chairman, no, that's inventory
Okay,
until it's
that's-
sold, and inventory is exempt.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thought that it was a really interesting idea from the group about the gas app, and I just want to go back to that for a second. just so I can do some mental math, how much is paid? Or, I mean, how many gallons are taxed a year roughly? I mean, I know it can fluctuate in the state. And then do you have any idea how much of that is like individual use, not for companies or whatever, but just for Wyoming driver's license, like, I guess.
Director, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, Representative, I don't know that answer right off the top of my head, but I'll definitely do some research. And if the concept, I think, a couple hours of work on that concept and we could probably get some pretty good answers. The key is the fluctuations that we see in fuel. So for example, what I had thought of, the $4 a gallon gas and anything in excess of $4, and that's when these refunds would kick in. Well, we see fluctuations in price of 30, 40 cents in a week. And so I think that is where this challenge comes in to play. If we were to put a gas app, there's no doubt in my mind that there are software vendors out there that could build an application that we could fairly quickly change whatever that refund amount is, whatever that price point is. I think we could do that. Of course, I was thinking we could even just brand it. I mean, it's one of those things that, I'm a Wyoming resident. And look what we've got in Wyoming. I like that idea much better than what many states, and you won't see it in our work group report, many states were just sending out checks to their residents and just saying, here's some money to offset the extra price you're paying at the pump.
Wow.
And it didn't have anything to do with how much they paid, or if they bought 20 gallons of gas that month, or if they bought 100 gallons of fuel that month. And so you won't see that concept in the report in any way. So that was a long answer.
Are you good? Representative, good? Okay. All right, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, Chairman Hansen also once again pointed out that in there is a link to the DOT study on gas tax. My memory is they broke it down on a per car basis. So I think that you can get pretty close to that answer.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Okay. All done with presentation? Good. All right, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to revisit the renewable diesel a little bit so I understand this. We've lost significant capacity of refining capacity here because they've converted to renewable diesel. And we've talked about the distribution costs, how that weighs upon the cost of product. Yet this renewable diesel is being transported all the way to California. So why is it advantageous for these companies to convert to a renewable diesel and ship it all the way to California? Obviously, there's a revenue difference, increased margin. And if Californians willing to pay this kind of a price with the differential in transportation, why don't they do that in their own backyard rather than in Wyoming? Why don't they do the renewable diesel conversion
Senator,
in their own
you want to,
refineries?
Senator, you're smiling. You want that question?
Yeah, he volunteered.
Yep. Senator Cooper, it's all yours.
Why don't they generate their own electricity? Sir, I'm sorry,
It's okay.
Mr. Chairman
We're looking for the
and
answer.
Representative Heiner. I think they don't want it in their backyard. And it's the same issue in my mind that we're running into with electrical generation. As we're shipping this stuff out of state, shouldn't we be collecting a tax on it? Most of the raw material for that refinery is, in my understanding, is coming in from out of state. It's being refined in Wyoming, so we're at least getting a few jobs out of it and some property taxes and whatnot, and then it's being shipped out of state. But that's we're basically just a pass-through place for it. So, I'm not sure why they're willing to pay that, but I know there's a lot of trucking companies that are pulling out of California. They're not willing to go into California and pay the prices they're having to pay for fuel. Another thing that came to mind and kind of along the same lines is how do we track this fuel, commercial fuel usage in Wyoming and how can we further help Wyoming domiciled companies defer their fuel costs in Wyoming. And we have a simple system out there. It's already there. It's in place. It's called IFTA. That these trucking companies report every mile they drive on every Wyoming highway. So it would be easily tracked, I think. But as far as why California is wanting to pay that, I can't imagine why they are, or why they don't refine it at in their own yard, because it's the product is brought in either in the raw stage or in the refined stage, and we just happen to have the refinery. So.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Are we at risk of losing additional refinery capacity to renewable diesel, which would be then sent out of state like this? We've lost quite a bit. Could this continue in the future as California is looking for more renewable products and they look to Wyoming to be their industrial backyard?
Senator?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Heiner, I believe we are. The Pasco refinery has been bought by the same company, operated by the same company, and I think, in my mind, I think we are at risk of losing, and that's our biggest refinery in Wyoming right now. So I think there's a real risk of losing that capacity. I haven't heard anything from them that they're going to, but I didn't hear them say when we talked to them that they weren't going to. So
Thank you. Representative Conrad, did you have one?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, thank you. Just one comment and then a question. In that same Kevin O'Leary show, he mentioned the cost of a new refinery at $14 billion. So I mean, that's a lot of money, at least where I come from. The question for you specifically is, to Senator Cooper's point, you mentioned a governmental private partnership. Are there any other states doing such a endeavor that you're aware of?
When?
Not that we're aware of. We didn't hear any testimony to that effect. I truly believe that it would just be a matter of what I always believe in. In Wyoming, we're a fewer population. We can sit down and we can talk about this stuff. And to the prior question, the companies are willing to come in and discuss this. So if there are companies and they'll tell us why they have moved to biodiesel, I think it's not anything that they would withhold. So I think it just warrants further communication. And that's what we're good at in Wyoming.
A follow-up, Mr. Chairman. So if I understand correctly, there are companies that are willing to come into Wyoming to build refineries and or expand?
Mr. Chairman, my comment was meant to be interpreted in that the companies that are here, I'm sure would come in and tell us their business story. I don't know about other companies' willingness to come to Wyoming.
Thank you.
We'll start to wrap this up. I do have a question, Senator. Back when you were working legislation this winter, our conversations seemed like our population, our ability to step up reserves and just have access to it and refineries was an issue just because of our small situation, not in terms of the size of the state, but just not enough population. What do you recall any of that? I'm trying to remember what you were telling me as you were getting that legislation ready.
I'm not sure the question. Brenda, do you?
When you were preparing your legislation
Mhm.
last winter, we were having discussions about that and you said perhaps the size of Wyoming was an issue. We just couldn't put something together for refineries. We're just not that big. We're not a Colorado. Don't want to be.
I don't recall that exact conversation, Mr. Chairman, but I think it's pertinent. We don't have the market here. I'm not sure what the right answer to that is.
So we close out. The three of you have any specific recommendations you'd like the committee to prep before we go into the Rock Springs meeting?
Mr. Chairman, I think we outlined them pretty well. I think, again, the ones I think are most feasible or at least worth a look, then they're in there. They're all there as options.
Okay.
And I think I agree, Mr. Chairman, with Representative Heiner. Let's have discussions about this renewable diesel. I mean, right now, it does leave the state.
All right. Anybody else from the committee? All right, Mr. Co-Chair, what's your desire? We close this out?
Mr.
Oh,
Chairman, I think
oh, yeah.
Director Henson
Our
has one
favorite-
last thing.
Our favorite topic.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, I do this pretty much everywhere I go these days. Wyoming Property Tax Refund Program. The applications can be submitted from now. The deadline is June 5th. I've provided some pamphlets at the back table. If you want to grab some, take some home. I just encourage citizens to go to wptrs.wyo.gov. That's our online portal. It has all the information about qualifications, criteria, and they can actually apply online. The one piece that it does take is actually adding a document. We do need documentation, proof of income, and proof that they paid their 2022 property tax. But just a brief plug for that. We've got about 4,500 applications to date. We've got about 2 weeks left. And last year we had a total of 4,400 applications for the entire program. So the amendments that the legislature made during the last session are definitely having an impact, and they're resulting in money in the pockets of taxpayers. So thank you for the time.
It's been the most difficult topic in the last few weeks that I've been through. All right.
Mr. Chairman.
Mueller.
I know everyone's itching to go, so I appreciate it. Pete Obermueller, Petroleum Association of Wyoming. I just wanted to answer Representative Heiner's question real quickly about why a company would make the switch and are we in danger of others making the switch? The answer to why is almost entirely related to the federal renewable fuel standard that requires refineries to blend in biodiesel and or corn ethanol or any of those things at an increasingly higher rate year after year after year. And in order to meet that, they have to buy what are called RINs on a market. Think of it as like like a sage grouse mitigation bank or something like that. You buy these RINs in order to meet your renewable fuel standard. It ratchets up and up and up and up to the point where a small refinery like Holly Frontier in Cheyenne, it no longer makes economic sense to refine petroleum products. It makes economic sense to do biodiesel. Now, the EPA has recently proposed that the next iteration of RINs and the renewable fuel standards from 23 to 25 shift towards moving towards more electric vehicles and away from accepting biodiesel as part of a blend for the renewable fuel standard. So I don't know what we go to after that, but refineries are going to have to, in addition to purchasing RINs just for the blend, have to now start, according to the proposal, we'll see where it ends up, start purchasing e-RINs for the purposes of making sure that the electricity that powers your Tesla, some of that should move increasingly towards renewable fuels as opposed to being fueled by coal or gas to fund to power your electric vehicle. So, Mr. Chairman, the economics are very much pushed by the federal renewable fuel standard, and we have limited ability to deal with that. Unfortunately, demand for that, of course, is in California, which is why it's exported, and they made that business decision at the end of the day. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm sorry to take more time.
Any questions for Mr. Obermueller? All right. Public comment on this topic
Yep.
in the room or on the internet.
Mr. Chairman, we do have one online. We have Pat Sweeney online.
Mr. Sweeney, we're closing it out, but keep it tight and go ahead. 1 minute. Mr. Sweeney, are you there?
Nope, done.
Is he still there?
Well.
Yes. Mr. Sweeney,
Yeah.
give us about a minute, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On the oil refinery, I would ask the committee to possibly ask at your next meeting if a representative from HF Sinclair would be available, because I think Mr. Obermueller answered a number of those questions, but EPA is really our enemy on a lot of this, and I think I know they've come to the legislature, Sinclair did a couple of years ago, about the smaller refining capacities. And I think anything that could be offered by the committee would be helpful. And Mr. Chairman, if I could take one more minute on nuclear, which I understood not taking public comment at the time. But
1 minute. Yeah, 1 minute. Go ahead, sir. 1 minute.
so my point on nuclear is that one bill that I haven't seen as a priority, but is of concern to me, is House Bill 116, prohibiting foreign property ownership in Wyoming. And if that is to be sorted out, I'm not saying it's not a bad concept, I'm saying it's got to be carefully weighed, especially in light of the nuclear uranium product and are definitely trona and soda ash. Some of these companies are out of country, and so I believe we'll see that again. I just hopefully we can have it better thought out to make it work for Wyoming. So thank you, Mr.
Thank you,
Chairman.
Mr. Sweeney. Appreciate it. Okay, public comment on anything that we've gone over the last 2 days. Final call for public comment in the room, on the internet. Okay. Mr. Co-Chair, we're ready to close this out? Announce the next meeting? Okay.
Yep. So
Next meeting,
Hold
July
on,
7th.
hold on.
Go ahead.
So, Brian, you want to go through? You've already gone through. We didn't give you anything today. Good. So, Representative Heiner.
Chairman Burkhart, you drafted a potential taxation of sequestration of carbon dioxide, which has been tabled right now. I am very proud of the state of Wyoming, and I don't want it to become an industrial backyard for every other state that wants to come here and dispose of their carbon dioxide without some benefit to Wyoming. So what I would like to ask is this, if we could bring this back at our next meeting and invite industry comment and public comment on this philosophy of taxation of carbon dioxide sequestration in Wyoming from out of state sources.
Mr. Co-Chair, explain to us the focus on what you were going to try to accomplish with that.
Hey, Mr. Chairman Committee, that was pretty much Representative Heiner just indicated it. I've heard a lot of feedback on taking out of state CO2 that would be considered waste and disposing of it here. So that bill was a personal draft. It shouldn't have been posted. It was for discussion only if we got to that point, which we didn't.
Okay, you were
So-
referencing out of state only?
Well, we can't do that directly because of the constitutional limitations on, in effect, targeting a specific industry or group or whatever. We can find ways around that with exemptions. But we can bring that back for discussion, I think. I
Let's
don't
have,
have a
yeah, we
problem.
do. Let's have the stakeholders as noted
Yeah,
at the table.
that's why Mr. Overmuller is here. He was worried that we would bring it up at the last minute.
Oh. No, I thought he was here to help Brandon. Okay.
Oh, okay.
All right. Thank you. Is there anything else, folks? All right, next meeting, July 17th and 18th in Rock Springs.
Mr. Chairman?
Go ahead.
One last thing, recent discussion, we'd planned at that meeting to offer the availability of a tour of the Trona mines. And we can't really, we don't have, it takes more than probably a whole day if you want to go underground. And talking with some of the members of the committee that indicated that they would like to do that, but other people wouldn't be available. So what's the committee feel about, in effect, maybe having two tours, one just tours the surface operations and then one does go underground?
Committee thoughts?
Any thoughts?
Okay, go ahead, Mr. Larson.
I think that offering two tours would be good. I actually have never been underground and I live in Rock Springs, so
Yeah.
I think it would be great.
But don't worry, we could put you underground. Okay, I'm getting some feeling that nobody wants just a surface tour. Okay, I'll see what we can, I'll see what we can set up.
Spooky down there. Let's try it.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Anything else, folks? Meeting is adjourned until July 17th, 18th.